That book that we were looking at, written by Deborah Hopkinson during the Time for All Ages, told us about several things. But it told us about freedoms, about rights, and every time there was one that was listed, or usually, there was something added about the responsibilities that we have to respect those of others and to make the freedom of others possible. And the rights and responsibilities that children have wherever they go, they begin in small places, at home, and then close to home, in school, and then in the community and the world. Where I grew up with parents who always prided themselves on the fact that they were free thinkers. And sometimes they would talk about freedoms, some of the freedoms that people have. This was just after World War II had ended, so there was a lot of talk about freedom. And when they talked about this at home, they also included the children, they talked about this at the dinner table. And sometimes they would say things like what we heard in relation to our book today. Even though the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, that was only passed in 1989. But like other children, then and now, and I think this is a wonderful thing, children, and I was one of them, have a sense of fairness and of entitlement and of freedom to express ideas. I think that sentiment is regularly captured so well in the cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes, which I follow religiously. And sometimes I used to put these feelings of freedom to work when I was young, when I was a child and an adolescent. So one day, when I was already in high school, I was enrolled in a school meal plan. It was kind of compulsory. And meals were not free. There was a fixed, although modest, amount that had to be paid weekly. And teachers paid the exact same amount as the small school children and the adolescents who were taking classes. And the teachers were kind of segregating themselves. They ate at a separate table in the dining room. It's kind of an old-fashioned way of doing things. I'm not so sure they still do that today. And I had noticed, because I was always curious about what was going on, I noticed that the teachers often got special treats from the kitchen. Like lobster. I thought this was incredibly unfair. So I discussed the situation with my school buddies, and I drafted a letter that was circulated for signatures during study hall. And the content, I don't know it by heart anymore, but it was rather inflammatory. It was something along the lines of every table in the dining room should be served the exact same food, since we all pay the same fee. There were lots of signatures. And my name was at the top. Well, the letter was placed in the school principal's mailbox in the morning, and then I went to class. I remember it was a class in ethics. But it didn't take long before the door of my classroom burst open with a bang, and the assistant principal, who we all knew was a terrible bully, stormed into our classroom. He demanded to know whose signature was at the top of the list. Of course, they already knew that, but he was trying to see if I had the courage to raise my hand, so I did. And I was brutally yanked out of the classroom by him and brought to the principal's office. I was interrogated without anyone to assist me, and I was told eventually that I would be tossed out of school. Now, that was problematic as a situation in Belgium, because at that time there were only two kinds of schools, and they were all connected to one another. One was the state schools, in which I was taking part, and the other option was the Catholic schools, but, my family was not Catholic, so they wouldn't have accepted me. So the state school was the only option, and being dismissed from there pretty much meant that I would have to end my schooling and work as a cashier in a department store. My parents were not pleased when I told them about this. Although my father liked that I was standing up for my principles and that I'd used my right to speak and to organize and to express our opinions. Yeah, so it looked bad for a while. But the next day, I found out that there are circumstances that make for some people to have more freedom and rights than others. Sadly so. The second signature right under mine on the letter was that of my best friend. And as it turns out, her mother had a very, very high-ranking position in the Ministry of Education in Belgium. And the school administrators didn't want to have to deal with the Ministry of Education. So I got to stay in school and graduate. That was wonderful. But that experience was one that kept my mind on issues of freedom and rights. And as an adult, I spent some time being a union organizer, and I was president of the faculty union at my university during a very difficult bargaining period when I thought I might have to go to jail because of an illegal strike, but it didn't happen ultimately. Now, putting things in perspective, the limitations on my freedoms and rights as a young person were minuscule compared to those experienced by children in our country today. And today I'm specifically thinking of the 5 children who were arrested after their father violently attacked people at a demonstration in Colorado. They and their mother were going to be immediately deported. That's really human trafficking, if you look at the definition. And the action was temporarily prevented by a judge, but they were not released. The last I heard, they were sent to a detention facility in Texas. And yet, we live in a country that has codified many freedoms into constitutional rights. And unlike what some people claim, our Constitution, if you read it, does not merely cover citizens. It is much broader. It covers persons. That means everyone within its border, including those 5 children and their mother, and actually also their father. Over the years, compilations of human freedoms and rights that cover all persons have have been made, and they started seriously after the atrocities of World War II. In 1941, President Roosevelt, and as an aside, you know that Eleanor Roosevelt was very much involved in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. But before that, President Roosevelt had delivered a speech called The Four Freedoms. The freedom to exercise free speech was the first one. The second one he called the freedom to worship, but that's kind of an oldish term right now. He probably meant the freedom to practice a religion of one's choice. And then there were two freedoms from something: the freedom from fear and the freedom from want. And when we heard today's story and related to those freedoms, we may have thought about the fact that there are freedoms from that are codified, freedoms to that are codified, and some of us think we talk a little bit too much about the freedom to do something in the US, like the freedom to bear arms, the freedom to do this or that, but not so much freedoms from. But when we look more carefully, and you see that in the four freedoms, freedom really requires both of those kinds of freedoms, a balance between the two. And on top of that, as we heard this morning in that story, the responsibility to make that possible for one another. That book that we were looking at summarized what is called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, passed by the United Nations, one of several conventions. And itself, it was adapted from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which doesn't mention children specifically. It talks about all, which certainly includes children. The Declaration and the Convention on the Rights of the Child have never been ratified by the United States. There's a whole set of arguments about why that is. Some say it's an external power, some say, it infringes on the rights of the states, and others say it infringes on the rights of parents, in the case of the children's rights. So what we have done as a nation is we have signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we have not ever sent it to the Senate for ratification. So it's been since 1989, so it's been a while, and it's not likely to happen in the next couple of years. And also, how would people enforce these rights? So it's really a general understanding, and in some places, in some countries, they have been codified into specific rights that are enforceable and that can be defended in courts of law. So for today, let's just recall what some of these rights are. In the United Nations Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are 30. And I'm not going to list them all here because I hate doing these boring kinds of things. And I'll just mention a couple as we go along. And also, you may have noticed I've been using the term freedom and the term right somewhat interchangeably. So let me just stop for a moment and reflect on how they're similar but different. A freedom is a general conceptualization of what should be allowed for all human beings. while a right couches freedoms in more legal and political language so that it's legally enforceable. And when we feel we have freedoms, we tend to also feel we have rights related to those freedoms. Violations of rights can be challenged in court, and they were just, again, recently challenged in relation to those 5 children and to other children and others who are arbitrarily arrested and subjected to deportation. Human freedoms and rights may not be easily enforceable, but they are acknowledged around the world as basic freedoms and rights that must exist for human beings to flourish. So I mentioned the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that lists 30 of them. And they're very easily to Google, especially nowadays with all that AI stuff connected to Google. So if you go to Google and you put in United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and then add 30 articles, you get the whole list. But here are some of them. And it begins the way a Unitarian Universalist would begin listing rights. All, it says, all are born free and equal. And then in the next article, everyone is equal regardless of, and then there are categorizations, like race, language, religion, and several others. There are some related to safety, like freedom from torture. There are some that relate to equal access before the law and to fair trials. There are some that relate to labor rights, social security, the right to work, the right to leisure, something we often forget in this country. I know people who think that they are lucky because they got overtime hours and now they can pay their bill. Maybe you should think in a different direction, but I sympathize, definitely. People have the right to a decent standard of living without working themselves to death. People have the right to equal access to public services, which really implies things like being able to get on a bus, those kinds of things. Be able to enter that school, that church building. People have the right to an education. And towards the end, there are some articles that relate to duties. There is the duty to others to protect their rights and freedoms. That's a really wonderful list, and I'm happy to read it every once in a while to remind myself of all these freedoms. Sometimes I forget that they do exist when I look around me. And when you think about these freedoms that are in the United Nations Declaration, you can also see how they incorporate those 4 freedoms. And you can also hear in the list that there are some freedoms too, like access to public services. And there are some freedoms from, like the freedom from torture. So it takes both of those kinds of freedoms. And the language that is used to indicate who has access to these freedoms is very strong. All are. And lately, the United Nations has moved in the direction, you can see some of that in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has moved in the direction of acknowledging all sentient beings. There are some conventions on the environment, so they're bringing in these ideas, but it's more and more beginning to be part of the overall understanding of the rights of living things. There are many regional organizations and groups of countries that have compiled lists, for example, the European Union. And there are also organizations, including the United Nations itself, that rank countries periodically to see where they stand in terms of their freedoms. You know, in this country, we often use the word freedom in all kinds of things we write about ourselves. When we describe what kind of nation we are, we call it the land of the free. We say, let freedom ring, things like that. It sounds so good. But how do we stack up? How do we do in comparisons? And these comparisons are all very similar because they look at the same kinds of data. The one I use for today is a typical one that was done by the Global Rights Project. And in comparisons like that, the nation that is typically at the top of the ranking goes from 0 to 100, and at the top you have not the United States. You knew that, right? At the top typically is Switzerland. And very near the top are countries like Norway, Scandinavian countries in general, Nordic countries, also the Netherlands, a couple of others. And the latest comparative ranking that I looked at was done for 2023. It's been a while now. Out of 195 countries, the United States was in 59th place in 2023. Now this was 2023. Not nearly as high as those countries that I just mentioned, because its score was not in the 90s. It was 64 out of 100. Every time my students got a rank of 64, they came to my office and complained. And I told them, study harder, or something along those lines. A score of 60 and below is seen as a failing grade on the Human Freedom Index. So we were just barely above that in 2023. We barely eked out a D-. But we did a lot better than countries like Russia, China, the Republic of Congo, and many others. After all, there are 159 countries we could point out. But still, many people in the United States are surprised about how low we stand. And you'll understand this in a minute, if you don't already, which I think you do. There are several categories of freedoms in those 30 in the United Nations Declaration. And you can categorize them in several ways, but the Global Rights Project makes four major categories. And here they are. The first one is about physical integrity, like the right to our own bodies. And that also includes no disappearances, no arbitrary arrests, and things like that. Yeah, it also means the right to terminate pregnancies. You can already see what's going to happen here. The second category is a category that's called empowerment. And in the category of empowerment, I was using that when I was in high school. Free speech, free congregation of people, freedom of the press, women's rights in various categories, religious freedom. And then there are worker rights as a category. That includes things like unionization, collective bargaining, freedom. Freedom to limited working hours and to have working hours. So there's two aspects to that. And then there are justice rights. The right to a fair trial. The freedom of non-governmental organizations. An independent judiciary. Yeah, some of these already sound worrisome, considering that we're in 2025. So why was our ranking so low? We were lacking quite a bit in things like empowerment, like women's empowerment. We haven't signed even the document of the United Nations to condemn all forms of violence against women. Couldn't we at least sign that? No, we haven't. That has never gone to the Senate. Freedom of the press, you might think we have it, but the press is very much subjected to financing from commercial areas, and that really limits its freedom. So imagine where we would, and eventually will, rank in 2025. I do fret about the future. So if those data come out, we're only partway through the year, almost halfway, okay? Yeah. But when we look at the whole year, we are going to do very badly in all of these categories. And may that be a wake-up call to voters who may hear about these data, and to those who represent the people in government. It's going to be a badge of shame. Some people thought it's already a badge of shame, but it definitely will be then. We will be way below the rank of 60. Now to say something positive. As Unitarian Universalists, we rank way up there. We are doing very well. As high as Switzerland? Perhaps. I haven't studied it, but I think so. I'd like to think so. The 30 freedoms of the United Nations Declaration connect very nicely with our 6 basic values. You can map them on all of these values, and many of them map on several of the values because they're all interconnected and they're all equally important. Values like equity, that's the first one that is mentioned. Generosity, helping one another have rights. Transformation, if needed. Pluralism and justice, it's all there. And I might even say we're probably more advanced in understanding the interdependence of all living things. We are more up to date in our thinking relative to the original Declaration of Human Rights. So what do we do with all this information then? Keep working, keep active, keep speaking, and do this thing that we call you the vote, as we say. Have flash mobs. We can, regardless of which year we are in, we can continue to build the beloved community. We can go back to the future. A future where all are welcome, all are safe, and all enjoy the freedoms envisioned in those universal conventions and declarations. And may we make it so. Let us get ready to sing